Well, today is August 17th, 2009, and I'm in the home of Ed Wilson here in Hot Springs Village. And we're going to do an interview today with Ed about his being a young boy. I think you said around 9 or 10 years old, Ed, at the start of World War II. Ed was a young boy in Scotland during World War II, and we're just going to talk to him about what it was like to experience Scotland as a young boy during World War II. And Ed, thanks for letting me come to your home and do this interview.
My pleasure.
Let's just start with, when you were born and where in Scotland you were born and raised and so on.
That's my phone.
We'll wait a second. So you were born in Scotland. When were you born?
In 1932.
Okay. And where in Scotland?
I was born in a town called Dumbarton.
Can you spell it?
Dumbarton.
Dumbarton, Scotland. Mm-hmm. And try to give us a sense of where in Scotland that is. What
Dumbarton is on the north shore of the River Clyde, which flows east to west,
okay,
rising someplace north of Glasgow, going through Glasgow, down the river, broadening out into an estuary, mm-hmm, and then what we call a firth, the Firth of Clyde, and finally into the Irish Sea.
I see.
The area, the north bank of the Clyde, was a shipbuilding area.
Your town was a shipbuilding area?
There was one shipyard in Dumbarton, but there were shipyards all up and down the mm-hmm north bank of the river.
What kind of ships did they build?
Queen Mary.
Really?
Queen Elizabeth. I think it was the birthplace of many, many large ships. Probably the Franconia, I don't know.
Okay.
But of course, by the time World War II came along, all of that production was converted to war effort, to ships of war as opposed to passenger ships.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't remain in Dumbarton very long. My mother died soon after I was born, and my father had another child, my brother, and he had to work, couldn't take care of two young boys, and so I was parceled out, as so was my brother. In my brother's case to relatives, in my case first to foster parents, and then to relatives a couple of years later. And that by that time I was no longer living in Dumbarton, and had moved to what I call my hometown, which was where I was raised, and that's in Ayrshire, in the Burns country, a place called Kilmarnock.
Can you spell it?
K-I-L
K-L-I
K-I-L
M-A-R
N-O-C-K.
N-O-C-K. Okay.
And that was where I grew up.
Okay. Ed, what are your earliest remembrances of, there's a war going on?
I'd say the first clear recollection was the radio announcement, which I believe, if I'm correct, took place on September 3rd, 1939.
Invasion of Poland.
Pardon?
The invasion of Poland.
Well, the declaration of war by Winston Churchill.
Do you remember hearing that on the radio?
Oh yeah. We were gathered around the radio. We had no television in those days.
Sure.
We had one radio, and it was a battery-operated radio. I remember very well. It had a dry battery and a wet battery. We called the wet battery an accumulator, like that, and the dry battery was like a cardboard box. And we had a fireplace, and we had 4 sets of earphones above the fireplace, so that everybody could hear what they wanted to hear.
Mm-hmm.
But we all had to listen to the same thing at the same time.
Yeah.
We didn't have a choice of channels.
What did you think when you were 7 years old about?
I don't know. I knew that something very important had happened. I knew it was bad news, because I was surrounded by people who appreciated what it meant and who had vivid recollections of the Great War, World War I, and who had served in it. So that everybody knew precisely, and it was a matter of serious concern. You've got to remember, by that time, Germany had taken Austria, Czechoslovakia, what else? And now Poland, and had nothing but rolling success.
Yeah.
And
Taking them easily.
yeah,
Really without a fight.
pretty much.
Yeah.
And I think we had, even then I think I had a view. It's hard to tell how many thoughts are your own when you're that age and how many are given to you by others.
Uh-huh.
But certainly we had a feeling of ineptness on the part of our government leaders, Neville Chamberlain, for example, who figured he could talk his way out of serious difficulty. And I don't think that the populace, had any illusions that the word of Adolf Hitler wasn't worth much. You know,
Meant nothing.
where he seemed to be easily persuaded.
Mm-hmm.
And before him, people like Lloyd George, an earlier prime minister, had been in Germany visiting the Führer and fawning over him and thinking that he was doing great things for Germany, and indeed he was, I suppose,
In the beginning.
given the circumstances.
Now, were you living with foster parents or relatives at this time?
I was living with relatives, with an aunt, an uncle, and my mother's sister and her husband. He had been in the Royal Artillery in World War I, and had been the victim of gas attacks. And they had a son who was 10 years my senior. He was turning 17 in September of 1939.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a recruiting sergeant in town. And the mothers were concerned for their sons. All the young men wanted to join up, even before the declaration of war.
Really?
But and certainly I think my aunt knew that her son was of a mind to go as soon as he could. He couldn't go at that age, but and our local regiment was a regiment of what we called territorials, what you would call Army Reserves. And it was a cavalry regiment, horse cavalry, complete with sabers, puttees, very smart. And I remember going just out of town, walking just out of town to a field where they were exercising, and they would have mock cavalry charges and with drawn swords. In fact, the two lines of horsemen would charge and go between each other with sabers. And I remember one night my cousin coming home with our saber through his sleeve, missed his arm, but went through his sleeve.
That close.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, I mean, that was a picture of our lack of readiness at that time, our lack of preparedness. The weaponry, such as it was World War I weaponry. The rifle was the Lee Enfield.
I think they were made in 1903, weren't they?
I don't know, but they made them for a long time.
Yeah.
And they were a very serviceable weapon, but certainly not anything that would impress you today.
After you heard the declaration there in, on or about September 3rd, what were the first signs that you saw that showed your country was gearing up for war?
Well, I don't know if I could say what was the first. I imagine things happened not suddenly, but gradually. What happened suddenly was the people understood the importance, the critical nature of the situation, and indeed our risk of being invaded and occupied. But there were immediate war efforts begun. For example, all the wrought iron railings were cut off and taken away as metal to be used for the war effort. Every piece of metal that could be collected, fences, rails, everything. In fact, I can remember as a little boy, I had a red tricycle, which I thought was the greatest thing I ever had. And I can remember taking it up and donating it for its metal to the war effort. So the sacrifice was the name of the game, and it was throughout the population, irrespective of age. We saved paper, tin foil, any metal, everything that could be used or reused.
Rubber?
Yes, indeed. In fact, after a while, rubber disappeared because what was it? I'm trying to remember. Things were made of synthetic rubber, and they weren't very good. They lacked a lot of the desirable characteristics of rubber, but we made do. Clothing was I don't know how it was done. I didn't understand then quite enough about how things worked. But we had a line of clothing which was known as utility clothing, and it was what would you say, Spartan. It had no frills. It used a minimum of fabric.
Like no pockets or?
No, it had pockets, but
It did have pockets.
they were just cheaply made and were conserving of whatever resources were involved. And clothing was rationed, of course. We were very soon issued ration books. Food rationing, sweet rationing.
Even you as a child?
Oh yes.
Okay.
And these books were issued periodically, and they had coupons in them, which when you purchased something, the merchant took the coupon out
Mm-hmm.
of your book, and when you were done, you were done. And with candy rationing, it was something like 2 ounces a week of candy. It was per person.
Okay.
It wasn't much, and I there was a secondary market sprung up for people who had coupons that they didn't want to use for themselves. They could sell them to others.
Mm-hmm.
See? I had a relative who was at my doorstep every time a new ration book came out and bought my entire page of candy coupons. But bananas disappeared, oranges disappeared. And we got, I think we were always an orderly society. We never were, if there were several people waiting to be taken care of, they would form a queue. I don't know whether this was a phenomenon of World War II or not, but pretty soon queuing was the name of the game. You queued for everything.
And that meant?
That meant you got in line.
Okay.
If you thought something that you wanted was going to be on sale, and you waited in line, and if there was enough of it and you were near the top of the queue, you might be successful.
Okay.
But we queued for everything. We queued for buses, we queued for trains, we queued for movies. It became a way of life. And I'm not sure how soon the blackout started, but we started first with taping all the windows, either with, I think it would be equivalent to a masking tape today,
Mm-hmm.
about 1-inch strips.
Black?
No, just the same colors we have, the
Okay.
tan color.
Mm-hmm.
And the windows were often, windows in the homes were double sash windows with maybe 6 panes in each window, and they would cross the pane with an X of tape. So every window, everywhere. The only variation I saw on that was something like, almost like lace, which was like a fabric which was put up, and the whole idea was to prevent glass from flying in the event of any attack.
Mm-hmm.
And every light had to be extinguished at night. We had air raid wardens. I think they were part of the ARP, what we call the air raid police, and each one had in his own neighborhood would patrol and make sure there were no lights showing in any home. If there was, they'd ring your doorbell and tell you to put the light out. No such thing. Cigarettes were hard to find, but if you had some, you daren't light it outside. Or if you did, even if there wasn't a warden or a policeman there to stop you, people on the street.
Others would.
Sure.
Yeah.
There were no street lights. All street lights were extinguished.
Mm-hmm. Was your area ever attacked?
Mm-hmm. We had a few bombs. Mostly on the outskirts of our town for some reason, and the kids would visit these sites the next day and be looking for souvenirs, bits of shrapnel, bits of anything, that might be flying around. But we were fortunate where we were. We had many alerts. It seemed like every night at 9 p.m. you could hear the droning of airplanes. And first the sirens would go off, and the warning signal was a oscillating type of signal, up and down, up and down, up and down. And when it was all over, the all clear signal was a constant and steady signal. In my town we had public shelters were built, and they were built underground. And I had, for a while, I had the job on a Saturday morning of going there and changing the water supply. We had bottled water in there and stuff like that. Changing the water supply and anything else that needed to be replenished. Of course, we didn't have bottled water like we know it today. We filled the bottles at a running faucet. But and those were, I don't know how deep they'd be, perhaps 20 feet under the ground, something like that. Dank, dark places, not very, and benches to sit on along the walls. I don't know that they were ever actually used in my hometown. They were ready, they were prepared, they were supplied and replenished regularly, but I don't recall ever. I certainly didn't use them, and I don't think they ever were used. As I said, most of bombing was sporadic around us, and it was on the outskirts. I believe, really, that what we got was possibly airplanes returning to Germany who had bombs to spare, and were dumping them to conserve fuel, rather than being the victims of an attack. I didn't get the feeling. But I remember I walked to school in those days. I don't know, probably maybe a mile and a half, maybe 2 miles to school. And first I crossed the river, and then I walked through a park, and shortly I came to the school. But I remember a couple of mornings particularly where I was ankle deep in tinfoil strips dropped by airplanes to confuse what I think was radar. It certainly was early days for radar, but apparently the dropping of all this tinfoil type of stuff upset the signaling or whatever equipment was being used to detect airplanes. And several mornings when I was going to school, I saw German planes rooftop high, flying home. I could see the crew in the cockpit. Whether these were, they weren't in great numbers, one, maybe two, but whether they were stragglers or lost or whatever, I don't know.
Any of them ever shoot at you?
No. I don't know about all the children, but I remember taking courses in plane spotting, so we could recognize what kind of planes, how many there were, where they were going, where they were coming from. And I tried to write down some of the names: the Junkers, the Dornier, the Heinkel, the Messerschmitt, the Focke-Wulf. And we had little books of silhouettes of airplanes so that we could compare them and recognize them and report. We weren't kept particularly busy on that.
But you knew there was a war on for sure, didn't you?
I was a bicycle messenger for the air raid police. They had a control, we call it a control headquarters, I think, which was activated, I think, at night. All of the bombings seemed to take place at night, and if there were messages to be sent, they were sent by bicycle, by a messenger on a bicycle, and I did that for a while, carrying messages back and forward. I don't know why they didn't use the phones. Never occurred to me. But, then, about what, see, we were in war, what, 1939 to 1945,
yes,
6 years. We'd been at it for about 3 years when Pearl Harbor occurred. And we were definitely braced for invasion.
Before that, let me interrupt you and back up a little bit. There was an incident that took place in Scotland before Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
When Hitler's, one of his confidants, Rudolf Hess,
Yeah.
flew the coop, so to speak, left Germany, flew to Britain, parachuted out of a plane.
Well, his purpose, as it was understood at that time, was to secure a meeting with the Duke of Hamilton. There were quite a number of people in Britain who were, prior to the war, sympathetic to Germany, admired some of the things that were happening in Germany, and sought to encourage good relations, continuing good relations. And apparently the Duke of Hamilton, a man I did not know, was one. And apparently Hess exercised some initiative in trying to secure an understanding with the British government through a personal visit and communications with him. He landed, my home was about 20 miles south of Glasgow, and Hess landed on a moor. We called it the Fenwick Moor, Fenwick, which was quite a large expanse of moor and marsh and rough country. Wasn't much good for anything, and that's where he landed, and that's where he was picked up.
How close was that to where you lived?
About 4 miles. We heard about it the next day. It was in the news, and but I don't know. It didn't
mean all that much.
It didn't mean that much to me. Number one, I had no concept of who this guy was, what position he held, how close he was to the top, whether he was acting with authority or without, whether he was escaping or coming to negotiate. And we had other things in the news.
Yeah.
I mean, we were in 1941, was that?
Yes.
I can't remember what deals were going on at one particular time or another, but I bet you we were fighting in North Africa at that time. There had been exploratory landings in Narvik, I guess. That was before the Canadians landed at Dieppe, I think. But there was enough fighting going on in other places, and we were getting daily reports of that.
I see.
That this wasn't a big event for me.
And then you mentioned later in '41, Pearl Harbor.
Was that 41, 42?
That was December 7th, 1941.
Okay. Yeah, and as bad as that news was for America and Americans, it couldn't have been any better for us. Monkey.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Come here. We had...
Because it got America involved?
Oh, sure. You got to understand, until America came in, we stood alone. Across, what, 15 miles, 20 miles of water, the channel?
Mm-hmm.
All of our men were overseas, fighting. What we had left was old men and young men. The old men were in a home guard. We called it the home guard. They uniformed and they drilled in the evenings. Sometimes they used brush shafts for rifles to drill with. There wasn't enough equipment for them by any means. And the young men, not all of them, but I was one who joined an Army Cadet Corps attached to our school. And we were preparing. We were the only defense available, the old men and the young men, if there had been an invasion. We went to military camps, we did maneuvers, we received, I'm sure the training wasn't as rigorous as it might have been in basic training in the Army, but we camped in military camps and we tried to do everything in the military fashion. Well, I even remember being in landing craft and coming in and making a landing on the beaches in Scotland. I don't know what we were training for because we sure weren't going to invade anybody, but maybe it was just to give us a taste of it. And we had a boy killed doing that. His harness got caught up in the landing craft door and he drowned. And we threw grenades. Well, they were clay mortar grenades. It was like a clay about the size of a baked potato, hard, with some sort of a firework in it. Struck it like a match to ignite it, throw it, and it shattered, but it shattered clay, not steel. And we used those in maneuvers. We were armed. I had a Sten gun. I was a section leader in this group of boys, and my Sten gun was at home. I fired it, but I only fired it when ammunition was issued and when we were in an organized exercise. There was no ammunition given to us at home, but the weapon was kept at home for obvious reasons in case of need. I said my area was lightly treated as far as bombing is concerned, but my hometown of Dumbarton was not. In fact, I pulled out a couple of things off the computer just to check on my memory. What we called the Blitz. And of course, the really hard hit areas were munitions factories, industrialized places. I'm going to have trouble finding this. But I don't seem to have it. The heavy bombing in Scotland centered on the River Clyde and the shipbuilding, aircraft building, naval harbors, naval installations, fleet anchorages, down the river, and as it opened out into what we called the Gerlach, which was where the American 7th Fleet took up residence later. The computer, when I looked at it, we talked about the Greenock Blitz and the Clydebank Blitz. Clydebank was a town adjoining Dumbarton on the north bank of the Clyde, and it was where John Brown's shipyard was, and they got hit very hard, as did all the towns on the river. Greenock was on the south bank of the Clyde, and caught pretty heavy too. But we learned of that attack, I don't know how, probably on the radio. And my aunt and I traveled by train about 36 miles north and west to Dumbarton to check up on our relatives. And I can remember very well walking with her as we went to her parents' home, my grandfather and grandmother. And we could see the house. It was a two-story house. You could see it from the street behind where we were walking. All the windows in the houses were gone. All the glass was blown out. Curtains were blowing in the breeze. And it looked like there was nobody moving. And we were very apprehensive. As it turned out, they had a above ground air raid shelter in the backyard, which they went to. It was tough for older people to go get up in the middle of the night, go downstairs, go to an air raid shelter, but people did it. And they were there in the air raid shelter, which was just like a brick building, when the bombing occurred. The town was hit terribly hard. Mm-hmm. I lost an aunt and uncle that night in a direct hit, and I had another uncle bombed out who crawled out, dug his way out in his pajamas out of his home, which was of rubble. It was a sad thing because in one night they could do a tremendous amount of damage. They would have done more damage, but we had two hills on the outskirts of town. One was called Dumbarton and the other Dumbarton, and they lit bonfires on those hills when the air raid started, and it misled a lot of the bombers, and a lot of the bombs fell on those hills, which would otherwise have created even greater devastation in the town. But I don't know how many people were killed that night. But when a building, buildings were what you call tenements. They were not separate structures. Whole houses were joined together on both sides of the street. And when a bomb hit, just created what was a house was now rubble. Well, all had to be dug out by hand and cleared. And of course, we wanted to find any survivors. We wanted to find the remains of anybody who was killed. My grandfather stood across the street from his son's house, his son and his wife. They were newlywed, young people, while they dug out the debris and the wreckage. They never found either one of them.
Your aunt and uncle?
Uh-huh. They found a lady's hand wearing her wedding ring. That was the only identification.
Of your aunt?
Mm-hmm. They lived, I think, on the second floor, and he had gone downstairs when the raid started to see what was going on, and the bomb that killed them was a direct hit, so neither one knew very much about it.
Yeah.
But it killed my grandfather. He stood there for days and days and days until they cleared that rubble and failed to find his son and his wife, and he was never the same. He died soon after. So.
Do you remember your thoughts when you heard about the Normandy invasion?
Oh yeah, deliriously happy. We had at various times, we had a lot of bad news. Pushed back here, pushed back there. Occasionally we had what seemed like good news.
Mm-hmm.
But when that occurred, of course, by that time we had all kinds of Americans, Canadians. We had a Canadian tank regiment in town. I can remember very well going there. They churned up the part like a plowed field with those tanks. And of course we loved to talk to the soldiers that were there. And I had relatives in Canada, and I remember asking one of them if he knew my aunt in Alberta. And of course he said, "Oh, sure." But and people were great. People invited the soldiers that were there into their homes, treated them like sons. Their own sons were overseas, and it was a great feeling. And by that time, let's see. We had D-Day, absolutely amazing. I can remember very well walking around with my relatives to a friend of ours he was our dentist, and he played the piano and very well. And a group of neighbors gathered there, and we were in our pajamas and robes, and we were singing and having a good time.
When you heard the news?
Celebrating D-Day, yes indeed. And even greater when it was VE Day, and even greater in VJ Day.
Talk about VE Day.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was what, 1945?
May 8, 45.
So by that time I was coming up on 13.
Mm-hmm.
And we were dancing in the streets, we were having parties. I remember significant, I lost a very good fountain pen that night. Fell out of my pocket at one of the open air parties. But yeah, we were feeling really good by then.
Was there a time, kind of announcing VE Day in Britain? I mean, was there a speech was Churchill still?
I can't recall.
Yeah, because I know
I can't recall when I think he was there through the war. It wasn't until after the war when he tried to run for re-election that times had changed.
Attlee, is that who took his place?
Clement Attlee, yeah.
I think it was Attlee that met with Truman and Stalin.
Yeah.
After.
That's right. Yalta, was it?
Yeah. Or Potsdam.
Was it Potsdam? It was Potsdam. That's right.
Yeah.
I always remember Churchill's famous expression when Mr. Attlee, before he was Prime Minister, that someone was extolling Mr. Attlee's virtues in the House of Commons, and among which they said he was such a modest man. And Winston Churchill rose to his feet and he said, "It is true. Mr. Atlee is a modest man. Mr. Atlee has much about which to be modest. But yeah, I don't recall how that announcement was made. I'm sure it was on the radio. It was still radio days,
Yeah.
and had to be. And the BBC. Well, what they call, they had two main programs: the BBC Home program and the BBC what? Light program. And you had no idea what those two, what the BBC did during the war. It was fantastic. First of all, they broadcast into occupied Europe. Not only messages of encouragement and news, but I think many times coded messages for people in resistance movements.
Sure.
But as to keeping up the spirits of the people at home, it was amazing. You know, in 1939, there was a new show opened in London. I can't remember what it was called. But it was... You wouldn't have thought, given the circumstances, that a new show would have opened. I can't remember its name, but one of the musical numbers came to my mind. Run, Rabbit, Run, and it was first performed, I think, by the show was called The Little Dog Laughed, and it opened in October 1939, which was a month after the declaration of war. Most of the London theatres were closed, and this they changed this Run, Rabbit, Run to Run, Adolf, Run, and they altered the lyrics a bit, and I mean even the little kids were singing and things like that, you know. It was a great feeling of, although we were afraid of being occupied, we never thought we'd lose. Never. Didn't enter our minds. In fact, I can remember that we had in the Army Cadets, we had an arrangement that if we were going to be occupied, we would not be taken. That we would head for the hills and carry on as well as we could, as long as we could.
Was Churchill instrumental in that feeling that we won't lose?
Absolutely. If you know, we hear politicians speaking. I've heard politicians speaking all my life, and I think we're always sometimes wondering if they really mean what they say, if they're saying what they really mean, and if they're saying it fully and completely. Churchill never gave that impression. I think he was probably the greatest orator that ever lived. And he had determination. You know, they talk about the British bulldog, the bulldog breed. He didn't only epitomize it; he looked like a bulldog. He had the jaw and the jowls, and the enlarged head. I only saw him once in my life. In my hometown, he was waiting for a train, and the train was going to be coming into the station to take him to England, and the people had gathered. People absolutely adored him. People had gathered on the opposite platform, and we were singing and everything else, and he was truly a great man, and I think it's hard to it's hard to say single-handedly did anything in that, because of a tremendous national effort.
Why do you think he was defeated?
Oh, I don't know. I think there was a growing movement of socialism. Britain had been a country which had built up a fantastic empire. You know, the sun never set on the British Empire. When I was going to school as a boy and learning geography, the British possessions, commonwealths, dominions, protectorates were coloured red on the map. And everything was, India was red. There was no Pakistan. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Tasmania, I mean, it went all the way, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaya, all red. And this was done by a class of people, a class of industrialists, and a class of financiers, and a class of adventurers who went to these countries, showed the flag, the red tunic, the brass buttons, the loud music, and literally imposed themselves on the populations. During the war, I think, perhaps, you know, particularly in the coal miners had a tough job and a tough life. And frequently the mine owners were unsympathetic to their needs. And I think the movement started probably there. We had a fairly active Communist Party as well, small but vocal and active. And the growing, people wanted a better deal for themselves than they had before the war. And I think saw the unfairness of some of the labor agreements and things of that nature. And the Labour government, which was socialist government, promised many things, including free health care, and was swept into power. And I think every government has to be changed periodically.
Yeah.
The worst thing for a government is to be in power too long.
What about VJ Day? August 1945, now the whole war is over.
Yeah. Well, actually, that was kind of a bit of a letdown. It was good to have the final nail driven, but there was a tendency to think that, hey, it's over, now we can get back to normal. Couldn't happen. It took years after that. We didn't get rid of rationing. Sometimes it was harder after the war than it was during it, because we didn't have the conflict to keep us galvanized. Now we had only the cost. People were coming back damaged, if they came back at all. Lives were disrupted. Housing was in short supply. Nothing got much better in the food area, or people weren't much able to afford it much more than they had. It was a bit of a letdown, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
After that.
Well, with the few minutes we have left, is there anything you'd like to conclude with here?
Well, I would say that people of my age in that country I've got to look at World War II as the single most significant event in their lives. And I still study and I'm very interested in all the revelations that come out years later upon closer investigation, and how things happened, why they happened, and it's good to revisit.
You think if the U.S. hadn't been involved, do you think he'd have been invaded?
Yeah,
Eventually?
definitely. There's looking at the subject since then, I think Hitler had some aversion to invading Britain. He seemed to see a parallel between the German psyche and the British psyche, and felt that we should be reasonable, and that we should acquiesce to him and be able to live together. Could never have happened from our standpoint.
Yeah.
But he would ultimately have been, depending upon how much damage Russia had done to him, whether he had the ability to go further after that, I don't know.
Yeah.
But, without America at that time, I don't think we could have held out.
Well, Ed, I want to thank you for taking the time this afternoon and share these memories with you, or with me, about your childhood. Quite a time to be a child during a war.
Yeah, we grew up fast.
Yeah. Well, thank you again.
Okay.
Appreciate your time.